Flipping the switch for electricity in our homes and offices is easy. We do it without a second thought. But the time has come to flip the switch on out-of-date energy policies in the United States. Currently, household energy burdens and the environmental harms of electric power generation from fossil fuels disproportionately impacts low-income people and communities of color. Energy law reform can and should alleviate these burdens. You see, technological advancements, energy markets, government financial support, and clean energy policies have changed the energy sector, but there are still barriers that impede progress to a clean energy transition that benefits all communities. So what can we do about it? We recommend that Congress first establish a federal clean energy standard. Second, direct the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to more explicitly incorporate clean energy policies into their decisions. And three, expand federal authority over building interstate electric transmission lines to allow more renewable energy resources to access the electric grid.
We all have places to be. We all want our stores and warehouses to be filled with the things we need, and that means a lot of cars and trucks on the road. In fact, transportation emissions are the single largest source of emissions causing climate change in the United States. But don't lose hope. There's enormous potential to curb these emissions. First, with our presidential transition, we need to revitalize fuel efficiency requirements. Second, we need to electrify the vehicle fleet to support emerging car and truck technologies, invest in charging infrastructure, and, of course, make sure that the electricity powering our vehicles comes from clean and renewable sources. Third, we need to drive less by investing in transit, by creating walkable and bikeable cities, and through land use design that reduces the need to drive. These shifts could have major upsides. In addition to causing climate change, transportation emissions, especially diesel emissions, cause health-threatening smog and premature death. If we direct clean transportation investments to the communities experiencing the worst pollution, we can not only reduce the risk of climate change, but also further environmental justice. With these investments in our infrastructure and our communities, we can keep America's economy on the leading edge while cleaning our air and protecting us all.
Our public lands serve so many important purposes. Beyond ensuring biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health, they are sources of clean water, renewable energy, and beloved areas for recreation like hiking, fishing, and camping. The notion of sustainability refers to meeting the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. So when it comes to our federal public lands, there are many aspects of sustainability to consider. We recommend enacting sequential mitigation legislation, which is a step-by-step strategy used elsewhere in the world to prevent environmental harms, to mitigate harms that cannot be avoided, and to restore land, water, and resources from existing harms. Congress and the executive branch must also implement climate adaptation plans on our public lands, protecting wild and scenic places, historic landmarks, and threatened and endangered species from sea level rise, flooding, wildfires, and other climate impacts must take center stage at the Departments of Interior and of Agriculture. This will have additional benefits too, such as safeguarding public health, clean watersheds, and nearby communities. We also recommend phasing out non-renewable energy development, creating biodiversity resilience funds to promote restoration of biodiversity, and legislating portions of the National Forest Planning rules to ensure sustainability in the face of climate change.
We're in a climate emergency, and climate change has disproportionate impacts on Black, Indigenous, people of color, as well as low-income communities. Pre-existing underlying inequities in the areas of housing, healthcare, infrastructure, and access to capital make these communities particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so these communities need Congress and the president to step up, to adopt policies that address these long-standing issues of inequality, and to tackle climate change mitigation and adaptation with these communities in front of mind. We recommend just transition legislation, which prioritizes Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income communities, and includes funding for planning processes, worker and community support, as well as data collection. We also need legislation that prioritizes distributed clean energy investments, lowers energy burden, and increases opportunities for ownership of local clean energy assets in these communities. And finally, we recommend Congress and the President establish climate adaptation parameters to achieve adaptation justice nationwide.
Climate change, it's a lot, and it can be overwhelming. There's no silver bullet to solve the problem, but there are actually quite a lot of ways to help address the problem. With a few key tools and strategies, we can successfully tackle the climate crisis so it doesn't have to feel so overwhelming. First of all, federal funding for research and development is absolutely essential. While the private sector continues to invest in alternative energy and energy efficiency, federal support is what we need for continued innovation. Next, Congress needs to establish a scientifically defensible estimate of the social cost of carbon, which means the amount of harm that's done by a ton of carbon. This reference point will make regulatory decisions easier to make. It's also crucial to defend and determine the role of carbon pricing, not enough by itself, but something like a carbon tax or cap and trade has benefits that can be part of our national decarbonization strategy. Finally, enforcement is crucial. Policies only work if they're actually enforced. So that's what we need. Now it's your move, Congress.
When Congress makes decisions and establishes new policy, it allocates authority of that policy to federal or state governments. Sometimes these allocations work, sometimes they don't. When it comes to addressing climate change, Congress has a real opportunity to avoid past mistakes by crafting a new regulatory structure. To do this, they should not only consider the trade-offs of assigning authority to either states or the federal government, but also the trade-offs of varying the extent of centralization by the particular government function, say funding or standard setting or enforcement. It should also consider configurations that assign overlapping roles for certain government functions, and also altering the amount and the type of coordination between state and federal authorities. I've been working with member scholars at the Center for Progressive Reform to lay out specific recommendations for these kinds of considerations. In our view, tackling the climate crisis can be done in an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way. Now we need Congress to act. Learn more at progressivereform.org.